The chandeliers of the old pink house cast amber light across faces frozen in shock. Evangeline Harrow stood motionless near the mahogany bar, her pearl necklace catching the glow of 200 years of Southern history embedded in these walls. Around her, Savannah's elite, women in silk dresses, men in seersucker suits, had gone silent mid-conversation. Her daughter Claire's graduation dinner, meant to celebrate a fresh law degree from Emory, had just become something else entirely. Something darker. Something that would be whispered about in garden clubs and country club lounges for years to come. 30 seconds earlier, her husband of 28 years, Preston Harrow III, had risen from his seat at the head of the long table. He'd lifted his champagne flute, cleared his throat with that familiar aristocratic rumble, and begun what everyone assumed would be a proud father's toast. Instead, he'd delivered a calculated blow. "I'm leaving Evangeline," he'd announced, his voice carrying across the private dining room like a judge's gavel. "I found someone who understands me, someone who makes me feel alive again." The words hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. This can't be happening. Not here. Not now. But it was happening. And Evangeline could feel every pair of eyes turning toward her, waiting for the breakdown, the tears, the humiliation to complete itself. But Evangeline Harrow didn't break. She didn't gasp or tremble or reach for her daughter's hand. Instead, she did something that would puzzle Preston for months to come. She smiled. Not a bitter smile or a broken one, but something serene, almost knowing. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax, and walked the length of the table in complete silence. Her heels clicked against the heart pine floors, each step measured, deliberate, powerful. When she reached Preston, she placed the envelope in his hand, leaned close enough that only he could hear, and whispered, "You should have been more careful." Then she turned, kissed Claire on the forehead, and walked out of the old pink house with her head high and her dignity intact. The Spanish moss outside seemed to whisper approval as she passed beneath it. What Preston didn't know, what nobody in that room could have guessed, was that the envelope contained 3 things: divorce papers filed that morning, photographs of his year-long affair with Delilah Crane, and copies of financial documents proving he'd been funneling marital assets into a joint account with his mistress. For 2 years, Evangeline had been playing a different game entirely. She'd spent decades as a financial manager before becoming a wife and mother, sacrificing her career to support Preston's real estate empire and raise their daughter in the Harrow family's historic Ardsley Park mansion. But she'd never stopped being shrewd. She'd never stopped paying attention. And when she'd discovered a receipt for diamond earrings she'd never received, she'd begun building her case with the same precision she once used to audit corporate accounts. Tonight wasn't the end of her world. It was the beginning of something Preston couldn't fathom, his complete undoing and her resurrection. The story you're about to hear isn't just about betrayal or revenge. It's about the quiet strength that builds in silence, the power that comes from preparation, and the freedom that awaits on the other side of a carefully planned exit. It's about what happens when a woman stops asking for respect and starts demanding it. Not with anger, but with strategy. Because in the Old South, where appearances are everything and family names carry weight, the most devastating victories are the ones nobody sees coming. Evangeline's envelope wasn't just filled with papers. It was filled with consequences 28 years in the making, and Preston Harrow was about to discover that underestimating his wife was the most expensive mistake of his life. The first crack in Evangeline's marriage appeared on a Tuesday morning in April, 18 months before the graduation dinner. She'd been searching for her good fountain pen in Preston's home office, a room she rarely entered, respecting the invisible boundary he'd established around his professional space. The pen had been a gift from her late father, and she'd used it that morning to write a condolence note to a friend who'd lost her mother. She remembered leaving it somewhere in the house, and Preston's desk seemed a logical place to check. She found the pen wedged between 2 leather portfolios, but when she lifted them, a receipt fluttered to the floor. Tiffany & Co., $8,700. The date was 3 weeks prior, their anniversary. He remembered, she thought with a flutter of surprised pleasure. Preston had been distant lately, buried in a new development project near Tybee Island, and she'd assumed he'd forgotten their anniversary entirely. They'd had a quiet dinner at home, just the 2 of them, and he'd apologized for not having a gift ready. "It's on order," he'd said, kissing her forehead. Something special. She'd told him it didn't matter, that his presence was gift enough. But secretly, she'd been touched that he'd planned something. Except the earrings never arrived. A week passed. Then 2. Then a month. Evangeline found herself watching the mail, checking for deliveries, waiting for Preston to produce the mysterious gift with a flourish and an apology for the delay. But he never mentioned it. And when she finally saw Delilah Crane at a charity luncheon at the mansion on Forsyth Park, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Diamond earrings, elaborate and expensive, catching the light as Delilah laughed at something one of the board members said. They looked exactly like the kind of piece that would cost $8,700. Delilah was 34, 12 years younger than Evangeline, with auburn hair and the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes and better cosmetic work. She worked in public relations and had been helping market Preston's luxury properties for the past 2 years. Evangeline had met her at several company events, had even liked her, found her charming and professional. Now, watching Delilah touch those earrings absently while she spoke, Evangeline felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was something colder, sharper. If I'm right about this, she thought, everything changes. But she didn't confront Preston that night. She didn't demand explanations or throw accusations. Instead, she went home, opened her laptop, and did what she did best. She started gathering information. Because Evangeline Harrow understood something that Preston had forgotten in his arrogance. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was ammunition, and she was about to start loading her weapon. But could she really prove what her instincts were screaming at her? Or was she about to destroy her marriage over a coincidence? Evangeline's investigation began with the kind of meticulous patience that had once made her one of Savannah's most respected financial consultants. She didn't hire a private investigator immediately. That would come later. First, she needed to understand the scope of what she was dealing with. She started with their bank accounts, the ones she had access to. Preston had always handled the bulk of their finances, insisting that his real estate expertise made him better suited for investment decisions. She'd agreed, content to manage the household budget and her own modest savings. But now she looked at everything with fresh eyes. The joint account showed regular transfers to a consulting firm she didn't recognize, Crane & Associates. $5,000 a month for the past 14 months, $70,000 total. When she searched for Crane & Associates online, she found a bare-bones website for a PR consultancy, but no client testimonials, no portfolio, no real evidence of a functioning business. The domain had been registered 2 years ago. The business address was a mail drop in downtown Savannah. This isn't a consulting firm, Evangeline realized. It's a funnel. Preston was moving money, their money, into an account controlled by Delilah, disguising it as legitimate business expenses. She spent 3 weeks documenting everything. She photographed bank statements, downloaded transaction records, and created spreadsheets tracking every suspicious transfer. She reopened her own business network, reaching out to former colleagues under the guise of possibly returning to consulting work. One contact, a forensic accountant named Marcus Webb, who'd worked with her on fraud cases years ago, agreed to review her findings over coffee at the Collins Quarter. Marcus was in his 60s now, with silver hair and the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent a career following money trails. He listened to Evangeline's summary, studied the documents she'd brought, and let out a low whistle. "He's not even being subtle about it," Marcus said, shaking his head. "These transfers are regular as clockwork, and if this Crane & Associates is what you think it is, he's given her $70,000 of marital assets. Potentially more if there are accounts you don't know about. In Georgia, that matters. If you can prove infidelity and financial misconduct, especially if you have a prenup with a fidelity clause," he trailed off, raising his eyebrows. Evangeline nodded slowly. They did have a prenup. Preston's family had insisted on it before the wedding, worried about protecting the Harrow estate. She'd signed it without argument, secure in the belief that their marriage was built on love and trust. The prenup included a standard fidelity clause, a provision that would void Preston's protections if he committed adultery. At the time, it had seemed like a formality, a legal checkbox that would never matter. Now, it was everything. "I need proof," Evangeline said quietly. "Not just financial records. I need evidence of the affair itself." Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone. "I know someone. Discreet, professional, used to work with law firms on custody cases. She's good at documentation. Photos, timelines, the kind of evidence that holds up." He texted her a contact. "But Evangeline," he added, his voice gentle, "once you start down this path, there's no going back. Are you sure?" Evangeline thought about 28 years of marriage, of the life she'd built in their Ardsley Park home, of dinners at the Harrow family table and Christmas mornings with Claire. She thought about the woman she'd been when she'd set aside her career, believing that supporting Preston's dreams was the same as honoring her own. "I gave him everything," she thought, "and he's been stealing from me while sleeping with someone else." "I'm sure," she said, and meant it. But as she walked back to her car through Savannah's historic squares, she couldn't help wondering, how long had Preston been planning this? And what else had he hidden from her? The private investigator's name was Simone Bouchard, a former Atlanta police detective who'd moved to Savannah 5 years ago and opened a discreet investigation firm specializing in domestic cases. She met Evangeline at a coffee shop in the Starland district, far from the social circles where they might be recognized. Simone was in her 40s, with short dark hair and the calm, assessing demeanor of someone who'd seen every variation of human betrayal. She listened to Evangeline's story without judgment, taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "How long do you want me to follow him?" Simone asked. Evangeline had thought about this. "Long enough to establish a pattern. I don't want one photograph that could be explained away. I want documentation that proves this is ongoing, systematic, undeniable." Simone nodded. "I'll start with 2 weeks of surveillance. If the affair is as established as you suspect, that should be more than enough." She quoted a fee that made Evangeline wince, $5,000 upfront, plus expenses. But Evangeline paid it from her personal savings without hesitation. Some investments were worth more than money. The documentation arrived 12 days later. Simone met her at the same coffee shop and slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside were photographs, time-stamped and dated, that told a story more damning than Evangeline had imagined. Preston and Delilah at a bed and breakfast on Tybee Island, checking in on a Thursday afternoon. Preston and Delilah having dinner at the Grey, an upscale restaurant where Preston had told Evangeline he was meeting potential investors. Preston and Delilah kissing in the parking lot of her condominium complex. His hand tangled in her hair with the kind of passion he hadn't shown his wife in years. But the most devastating image was the simplest. Preston and Delilah sitting on a park bench in Forsyth Park, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, looking for all the world like a couple deeply in love. The timestamp showed it was a Wednesday morning. The same Wednesday morning, Preston had told Evangeline he was driving to Atlanta for a property meeting. He'd kissed her goodbye in their kitchen, complained about the traffic he'd face, and promised to be home by dinner. Instead, he'd been 20 minutes away, playing out a romance in the same city where his wife was probably buying groceries or having lunch with friends. Evangeline sat in her car after the meeting, staring at the photographs spread across her passenger seat. She waited for the tears to come, for the emotional collapse she'd been bracing for since the moment she'd found that Tiffany receipt. But instead, she felt something else. A cold, clarifying rage that sharpened her thoughts like a whetstone against a blade. He didn't just betray me, she realized. He's been living a double life. He's been stealing from our marriage to fund a fantasy while I've been home maintaining the illusion. And in that moment, sitting in her car with afternoon sunlight slanting through the windshield, Evangeline made a decision. She wasn't going to confront Preston. She wasn't going to give him the opportunity to lie, to manipulate, to turn this around on her somehow. Instead, she was going to build a legal case so airtight that when she finally struck, there would be no defense, no negotiation, no way out. She called her attorney that evening. Victoria Chen was a family law specialist with a reputation for fierce advocacy and creative legal strategy. She'd handled the divorce of a friend of Evangeline's 3 years ago and had secured an outcome so favorable that it had become legendary in their social circle. Victoria agreed to meet the next morning. When Evangeline laid out the evidence, the financial records, the photographs, the prenuptial agreement with its fidelity clause, Victoria's expression shifted from professional interest to predatory satisfaction. "We can destroy him," she said simply. "The question is, How thorough do you want to be? Evangeline looked at her attorney and saw her own determination reflected back. I want everything he took from me returned, plus damages for what he stole. I want the house, the investments he moved without my knowledge, and a settlement that ensures he understands the cost of his choices. I want him to know that underestimating me was his biggest mistake. Victoria smiled. Then let's get to work. But as Evangeline drove home to the mansion she still shared with Preston, she wondered, when the moment finally came, would she have the courage to pull the trigger, or would 28 years of shared history make her hesitate? The next 6 months were the strangest of Evangeline's life. On the surface, nothing changed. She and Preston continued their routines, dinners at home, Sunday mornings reading the paper in the sunroom, small talk about Claire's progress in law school and Preston's latest development project. To anyone watching, they were a successful, stable couple navigating the comfortable rhythms of a long marriage. But beneath the surface, Evangeline was methodically dismantling the foundation of Preston's world. She worked with Victoria to file the divorce papers, but didn't serve them. They sat in Victoria's office safe, ready to be deployed at the perfect moment. She worked with Marcus to trace every dollar Preston had transferred to Delilah, documenting a pattern of financial infidelity that now totaled over $90,000. She copied files from Preston's home computer while he was in the shower, forwarding emails between him and Delilah that detailed not just their affair, but his plans to eventually leave Evangeline once the Tybee Island project was complete and the money was secured. She even found emails where Preston and Delilah discussed their future together. A beachfront condo in Charleston, travel to Europe, a life free from what Preston called the weight of old obligations. The hardest part wasn't the investigation, it was maintaining the mask. Evangeline had to smile across the dinner table at a man she now saw clearly for the first time. She had to listen to Preston complain about stress at work while knowing he was stealing from their marriage to finance a relationship with another woman. She had to attend social events at his side, playing the role of the devoted wife, while Delilah was often in the same room, playing the role of the professional colleague. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting, but Evangeline discovered something unexpected during those months. She was good at this. The skills she'd honed as a financial consultant, patience, attention to detail, strategic thinking, translated perfectly to building a legal case. She began to see her marriage as a puzzle she was solving, each piece of evidence another part of a larger picture. And as the picture became clearer, so did her sense of self. She realized she'd spent nearly 3 decades defining herself through Preston's needs and desires, shrinking herself to fit the role of harrow wife. Now, in the process of documenting his betrayal, she was remembering who she'd been before, sharp, capable, independent. She also started planning her next chapter. Late at night, after Preston had gone to bed, she'd sit in the study with her laptop and research business plans for a financial consulting firm specializing in women's wealth management. She reached out to former colleagues, quietly rebuilding her professional network. She toured small office spaces in downtown Savannah, imagining where she might land after the divorce. She even designed a logo, a phoenix rising from flames, which felt almost too on the nose, but captured exactly how she felt. The turning point came in October, when Claire called with news. She was graduating in December, a semester early, after taking a heavy course load her final year. She wanted to celebrate with a family dinner, something special to mark the occasion. Preston suggested the old pink house, and Claire loved the idea. As Evangeline hung up the phone, she felt the final piece of her plan click into place. This is it, she thought. This is the moment. She would give Preston one last family celebration, one final opportunity to play the proud father and devoted husband. And then, in front of everyone who mattered, she would hand him the envelope and walk away. But there was one thing she hadn't accounted for. Would she be able to look her daughter in the eye afterward and explain why she'd chosen Claire's graduation as the stage for this revelation? The weeks leading up to the graduation dinner were a masterclass in compartmentalization. Evangeline helped Claire shop for an outfit for the celebration, a sophisticated emerald dress that complemented her daughter's dark hair and made her look every inch the accomplished attorney she was about to become. She coordinated with the restaurant, ensuring the private dining room would be perfect. She invited Preston's business associates and their closest family friends, creating a guest list that represented the full scope of their social circle. Everyone who mattered would be there to witness what came next. Preston, oblivious to the trap being set, threw himself into planning his toast. He spent hours revising it, practicing in front of the mirror in their bedroom. Evangeline watched him prepare, knowing that he was about to deliver something entirely different, and that his actual speech would destroy the reputation he'd spent years building. She felt no satisfaction in this knowledge, only a grim sense of inevitability. He chose this, she reminded herself whenever doubt crept in. He made decisions every single day for over a year that led here. I'm just revealing the truth. But there was one conversation Evangeline couldn't avoid. She had to tell Claire something of what was coming, though not everything. 3 days before the dinner, she invited her daughter to lunch at Colin's Quarter, just the two of them. Claire arrived glowing with post-graduation energy, full of stories about her final exams and plans for taking the bar exam. Evangeline let her talk, memorizing the joy in her daughter's face, knowing she was about to dim it. "Claire," she finally said, reaching across the table to take her daughter's hand, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to trust me." Claire's expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong?" Evangeline chose her words carefully. "Your father and I are going through some difficulties. Things you don't know about yet, things I've been handling privately. The dinner on Saturday is going to be complicated, and I need you to know that whatever happens, it's not your fault, and it's not about you. Your graduation is an incredible achievement, and I'm so proud of you, but the evening may not go the way you expect." Claire stared at her mother, processing. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" Evangeline hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but not in the way you might think. Just trust me, and know that I love you, and that everything I'm doing is to protect our family, even if it doesn't feel that way at first." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she squeezed her mother's hand. "Okay," she said quietly. "I trust you." It was the bravest thing Evangeline had ever heard her daughter say. And in that moment, she knew she was making the right choice, not just for herself, but for Claire too. Her daughter deserved to see what strength looked like, what it meant to refuse to be diminished. The night before the dinner, Evangeline barely slept. She lay in bed next to Preston, listening to him snore softly, and thought about all the nights like this. Thousands of them, stretched across 28 years. Mornings waking up together, evenings falling asleep in comfortable silence. The weight of history was almost unbearable. "I loved him," she thought. "I really did. And maybe he loved me once too." But love wasn't enough when it existed alongside betrayal, when it was used as a cover for deception and theft. Evangeline understood now that she'd been clinging to a ghost, to a version of Preston and their marriage that maybe never existed or had died so gradually she hadn't noticed until she was standing in the ruins. At dawn, she got up, showered, and dressed with care. She chose a navy dress, elegant, powerful, appropriate for both celebration and confrontation. She put on the pearl necklace her mother had given her on her wedding day, a talisman of the woman she'd been and the woman she was becoming. She slipped the envelope into her clutch, feeling its weight like a promise. And then she went downstairs, made coffee, and waited for the day that would change everything to begin. But even now, with everything prepared, one question haunted her. Was she doing this for justice, or was some part of her driven by revenge? And did it matter? If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next one. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can even buy me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every little bit helps keep these stories alive. Now, let's get back to it. The old pink house was magnificent that evening, its 18th century architecture glowing in the December twilight. The restaurant had been a mansion once, home to Revolutionary War heroes and generations of Savannah families. Now it served as a temple to Southern hospitality and old-world grace. Evangeline arrived early with Preston, watching as their guests filtered in. Business associates, family friends, Claire's law school classmates. Everyone was dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate. Preston was in rare form, working the room with the charisma that had always been his greatest asset. He shook hands, told stories, laughed at jokes. He wrapped his arm around Evangeline's waist at one point, kissing her temple in a gesture that would have seemed affectionate to anyone watching. She smiled and leaned into him, playing her part one last time. Across the room, she noticed Delilah hadn't been invited. A small mercy, or perhaps a sign that Preston still understood some boundaries, even while violating all the important ones. Dinner was a blur of courses and conversation. She watched Claire shine, telling stories about law school and her plans to join a civil rights firm in Atlanta. She watched Preston beam with paternal pride, and she wondered if he understood that this might be the last time Claire looked at him with uncomplicated love. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. I could still stop this, she thought. I could choose to handle this privately, to spare Claire and everyone else this public spectacle. But then she remembered the emails, the photographs, the $90,000 stolen from their marriage, and she understood that privacy would only protect Preston. This needed to be public. The people in this room needed to see who Preston really was. When dessert was cleared and the moment for toasts arrived, Preston stood up. He tapped his champagne flute with a fork, and the room fell silent. Evangeline's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. But then Preston surprised her. For the first 5 minutes of his speech, he delivered exactly what everyone expected. A loving tribute to Claire's hard work, her intelligence, her bright future. He told stories about teaching her to ride a bike in Forsyth Park, about family vacations to Charleston and Tybee Island. He praised Evangeline for being an incredible mother. The room was rapt, charmed by the image of this accomplished family and their fairy tale life. Then his tone shifted. "But I have another announcement to make tonight," Preston said, his voice taking on an edge that made Evangeline's blood run cold. "Because important moments deserve honesty, and I owe you all the truth." He looked directly at Evangeline, and she saw something in his eyes. Defiance, cruelty, a need to control the narrative, even as he destroyed it. "Evangeline, I'm leaving you. I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. Someone who understands me in ways you never have. I've given you 28 years of my life and I deserve to be happy now. I'm sorry to do this here, but I'm not sorry for my choice." The room erupted in shocked whispers, but Evangeline didn't hear them. She was already standing, already moving, already reaching into her clutch for the envelope that would flip this entire script. He thinks he controls this moment, she realized. He thinks he's the one making the brave choice, the one seizing power. He had no idea that he'd just walked into a trap 2 years in the making. But as she stood there with the envelope in her hand, she couldn't help wondering, would this public humiliation heal her, or would it haunt her forever? The walk from Evangeline's seat to Preston's end of the table felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. She was aware of every eye in the room tracking her movement, every whisper dying into silence as people realized something else was about to happen. Preston watched her approach with confusion starting to edge into his expression. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd expected tears, collapse, maybe a dramatic exit. Not this calm, purposeful advance. When she reached him, she held out the envelope. "You should open this now," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "While everyone's here. While you still think you've won." Preston took the envelope, his hands starting to shake slightly as he broke the wax seal. She watched his face as he unfolded the papers inside, watched confusion shift to comprehension, then to pure panic. The divorce petition was on top, complete with the fidelity clause highlighted in yellow. Beneath it, the photographs, Preston and Delilah at Tybee Island, at the Gray, in Forsyth Park. And beneath those, the financial records showing every transfer to Crane and Associates, every dollar stolen from their marriage. "What is this?" Preston's voice cracked. Evangeline smiled, not with cruelty, but with the serene confidence of someone who'd already won. "It's the truth, Preston. The whole truth. Everything you've been doing for the past 2 years, documented and dated. The affair you thought was private, the money you stole to fund it, and the prenuptial agreement you forgot about. The one with the fidelity clause that voids all your protections and entitles me to full marital assets, plus damages." She let that sink in, watching his face drain of color. "I filed for divorce this morning. The papers were served to your office at 4 p.m. You'll receive formal notice tomorrow, but I wanted you to have advance warning, courtesy of 28 years together." The room was dead silent now. Evangeline could feel Claire's eyes on her, could sense the shock radiating from every guest. She turned to address them all, her voice steady. "I apologize for disrupting this celebration of Claire's achievement, which is the only thing tonight that truly matters. But I wanted witnesses to this moment, because I've learned that truth matters, that accountability matters, and that sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to refuse to be silent about someone else's choices." She looked back at Preston. "You told me tonight that you deserve to be happy. And you're right, everyone deserves happiness. But not at the cost of integrity, not by stealing from your partner, not by living a lie while expecting your spouse to maintain your public image." Then she turned to Claire, who was standing now, tears streaming down her face. But whether from anger or pride or shock, Evangeline couldn't tell. "I love you," Evangeline said to her daughter. "And I'm sorry this happened tonight. But I wanted you to see that strength isn't about never being hurt. It's about choosing not to shrink yourself to accommodate someone else's betrayal." Claire crossed the room and pulled her mother into a fierce hug. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." Evangeline held her daughter for a long moment, then gently pulled away. She took one last look at Preston, who was still standing there with the envelope in his hands, looking smaller somehow than he had minutes ago. "This is what power looks like when you take it back," she thought. Not loud, not desperate, just sure. She gathered her clutch, straightened her pearls, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she could hear voices starting to rise, friends confronting Preston, people demanding explanations. But she didn't look back. She'd said everything that needed saying. The rest was just aftermath. Outside, the Savannah night wrapped around her like a blessing. The Spanish moss and the live oaks swayed in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour. Evangeline stood on the steps of the old pink house and breathed deeply, feeling lighter than she had in years. "I'm free," she realized. For the first time in decades, I'm completely free. But freedom, she was learning, came with its own weight. The weight of uncertainty, of a future unmapped. As she walked toward her car, one question lingered. Now that she'd reclaimed her life, what would she build with it? The legal proceedings that followed were swift and brutal. Preston, confronted with irrefutable evidence of his infidelity and financial misconduct, had no defense. His attorneys tried to negotiate, tried to argue that the fidelity clause was unconscionable, tried to claim that Evangeline had somehow entrapped him. But Victoria Chen demolished every argument with the kind of surgical precision that had made her reputation. Within 3 months, the divorce was finalized. The settlement was devastating for Preston. Evangeline retained the Ardsley Park mansion, the home where they'd raised Claire, where she'd built a life now reclaimed as her own. She received 70% of their marital assets, plus reimbursement for the $90,000 Preston had transferred to Delilah, plus damages for emotional distress. Preston's real estate holdings were liquidated to pay the settlement, including the Tybee Island project he'd been so proud of. His business, which had depended heavily on the reputation and connections of the Harrow family name, collapsed as clients quietly withdrew and investors distanced themselves from the scandal. Delilah, faced with the public exposure of the affair and her role in accepting stolen marital funds, vanished from Savannah entirely. She closed Crane & Associates, broke her lease on the condominium, and reportedly moved to Charlotte to start fresh. Preston, suddenly alone and substantially poorer, tried to reach out to old friends for support and found doors politely but firmly closed. The same social circles that had celebrated him months earlier now treated him as a cautionary tale. He moved into a small apartment downtown, a dramatic fall from the mansion he'd once considered his domain. But while Preston's world contracted, Evangeline's expanded. She used a portion of her settlement to open Harrow Wealth Management, a boutique financial consulting firm specializing in serving women navigating major life transitions: divorce, widowhood, career changes, retirement. Her first clients came through referrals from Victoria, women who'd seen what Evangeline had accomplished and wanted that same fierce advocacy for their own financial futures. Within 6 months, she had a waiting list. Within a year, she'd hired 2 associates and moved into a larger office space on Broughton Street. Claire passed the bar exam on her first attempt and joined the civil rights firm in Atlanta as planned. She visited her mother every few weeks, and their relationship deepened in ways Evangeline had never anticipated. They talked about strength and vulnerability, about the difference between endurance and surrender, about what it meant to build a life on your own terms. Claire saw her father occasionally, awkward lunches where Preston tried to explain his choices, and Claire listened with the polite distance of someone who'd fundamentally reassessed a relationship. She's learning, Evangeline thought, that love doesn't mean accepting harm. That's a lesson I wish I'd learned earlier. 2 years after the divorce, Evangeline attended a charity gala at the Telfair Museum. She wore a red dress that made her feel powerful and alive, and she laughed with friends old and new. Across the room, she glimpsed Preston with a woman she didn't recognize. Younger, clearly uncomfortable in the setting, a placeholder for something he'd lost and would never reclaim. Their eyes met briefly. Preston looked away first. Evangeline felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter closed. He's not my story anymore, she realized. He's barely even a footnote. The real revelation came late that night, as Evangeline sat in the sunroom of her Ardsley Park home with a glass of wine and the latest financials from Harrow Wealth Management spread across the coffee table. The business was thriving beyond her projections. She was helping women reclaim their economic power every single day, using the same skills she'd once used to dismantle Preston's lies. She'd built something meaningful from the wreckage of her marriage, something that honored both who she'd been and who she was becoming. This, she thought, is what resurrection looks like. Not revenge, not even justice, just the freedom to build something true. The envelope that had contained divorce papers and evidence of betrayal had ultimately contained something else entirely. Permission to stop shrinking, to stop accommodating, to stop pretending that loyalty meant accepting less than she deserved. Preston had thought he was taking control of his narrative that night at the old pink house, but he'd actually handed her the perfect moment to reclaim hers, and she'd seized it, not with cruelty, but with the quiet, devastating power of a woman who'd finally stopped asking for respect and started demanding it. The question she'd asked herself that night, whether this was justice or revenge, no longer mattered, because she understood now that it had been neither. It had been liberation, pure and simple, and everything that followed was just the natural consequence of finally, fully, choosing herself. There's a particular kind of strength that only emerges from betrayal, not the loud, dramatic kind that announces itself with fireworks and declarations, but the quiet kind that builds in silence, the kind that gathers evidence while smiling at dinner, that plans escape routes while maintaining routines, that transforms pain into strategy and humiliation into power. Evangeline Harrow's story isn't really about revenge, though it might look that way from the outside. It's about something more fundamental, the moment when a person decides they're worth fighting for, worth planning for, worth saving. For 28 years, Evangeline had believed that a good marriage required sacrifice, compromise, and the willingness to make yourself smaller to accommodate someone else's dreams. She'd set aside her career, her ambitions, her sense of self, believing that supporting Preston was the same as honoring herself. And perhaps in a healthy partnership, those things can coexist. Support and self-preservation, love and autonomy. But in a relationship built on deception, where one person is systematically taking while the other is endlessly giving, that balance becomes toxic. The envelope Evangeline handed Preston wasn't just filled with legal documents. It was filled with the accumulated weight of years spent shrinking herself, and the sudden, explosive relief of finally expanding again. What makes Evangeline's story particularly powerful is that she didn't just survive her husband's betrayal, she strategized around it. She used the same skills that had made her successful in her career to build an airtight case against the man who'd underestimated her. She transformed herself from victim to architect of her own liberation. And in doing so, she created a template that dozens of other women would follow through her consulting firm, learning that financial literacy isn't just about managing money. It's about managing power, about understanding that economic independence is the foundation of every other kind of freedom. The question at the heart of this story is one we all face in different ways. When do you stop tolerating what diminishes you? When do you stop making excuses for behavior that erodes your dignity? When do you decide that maintaining peace isn't worth sacrificing your sense of self? For Evangeline, that moment came when she found a receipt for diamond earrings she'd never received. But the real transformation didn't happen in that instant. It happened in the 2 years that followed, as she methodically documented her husband's betrayal while continuing to live beside him, as she rebuilt her professional network while playing the role of devoted wife, as she planned her exit while maintaining the facade of stability. Some might argue that Evangeline's choice to reveal the divorce at Claire's graduation dinner was cruel, that it unnecessarily turned a celebration into a spectacle. But context matters. Preston had chosen that same moment to announce his departure, believing he controlled the narrative, believing Evangeline would crumble under the public humiliation. What he didn't understand was that she'd been preparing for exactly this scenario, that she'd anticipated his cruelty and planned for it, that she'd turned his weapon into her shield. The public nature of her response wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, about refusing to protect someone who'd spent years deceiving her. Today, Evangeline's story circulates in whispers through Savannah's social circles, a cautionary tale for men who underestimate their wives, and an inspiration for women trapped in marriages where they've lost themselves. Her consulting firm thrives because she understands, in a way that no amount of professional training can teach, what it feels like to have your economic power stripped away, to realize you've been financing your own diminishment. She helps women see the patterns she once missed, helps them build exit strategies while there's still time, helps them understand that loyalty to yourself must always come before loyalty to someone who's betrayed you. The final irony of Preston's story is that he got exactly what he said he wanted: freedom from old obligations, the chance to start fresh, the opportunity to be with someone who understood him. But freedom without integrity is just isolation, and fresh starts built on betrayal have a way of collapsing under their own weight. Delilah left him. His business failed. His reputation crumbled. Not because Evangeline destroyed him, but because he'd built his life on a foundation of lies, and when that foundation was exposed, everything collapsed. Evangeline didn't need to punish Preston. The natural consequences of his choices did that work for her. So what can we learn from the envelope that changed everything? Perhaps this: that preparation is power, that documentation beats accusation, that patience often yields better results than immediate confrontation, that financial literacy is self-defense, that you can't negotiate with someone who's already decided you're expendable, that sometimes the most dignified response to betrayal isn't forgiveness, it's accountability. That strength doesn't mean never being hurt. It means refusing to stay diminished. And perhaps most importantly, that the life you build after betrayal can be more authentic, more purposeful, more fully yours than anything that came before. Evangeline still lives in the Ardsley Park mansion, but it feels different now, not like a museum of a marriage that failed, but like a home she's claimed fully as her own. She's dating occasionally, though she's in no rush to remarry. She travels, she mentors, she builds her business and watches it grow. And sometimes, late at night, she thinks about that moment at the old pink house, when she handed Preston the envelope and walked away. She thinks about how terrified she was beneath the calm exterior, how uncertain she felt about whether she was doing the right thing, and she wishes she could go back and tell that version of herself, "You're stronger than you know." The life waiting on the other side of this moment is worth every ounce of courage it takes to walk toward it. What envelope are you carrying? What truth are you waiting for the right moment to reveal? And more importantly, what life are you building in the silence when no one's watching? That will sustain you when everything changes. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If it touched you or made you think about life in a different way, don't keep it just for yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this too. And if you truly want to support this channel, please subscribe, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading what you have to say. And finally, if you really enjoyed it and want to help keep these stories alive, consider buying me a simple coffee on Ko-fi. Even the smallest gesture makes a big difference and helps us bring more stories like this to you. Thank you, and see you in the next one.